Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for Missions Monday. And today's topic is about the sovereignty of God and the dubitation of man. It's a fancy word of saying our doubts. And we see this through today's passage in Acts 16. So if you have your Bibles, let's turn to the book of Acts, chapter 16. And as you're turning there, there's some background. Paul is partnered with his disciple Timothy, and they're going to go throughout the region of the Mediterranean to strengthen churches. And so Paul has been following God's Spirit to go throughout the land, and we come to a part where God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit, blocks Paul from entering a place that he was called to originally. So it's a little confusing. So Acts 16, verse 6. And they, that is Paul and Timothy, went throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So Paul and Timothy are super pumped about going to this one region throughout Asia to speak and to preach the gospel. But the Holy Spirit blocks them. It doesn't say how he does, but I think the Holy Spirit prompts him. Either he closes the door or he speaks directly to Paul. Either way, Paul and Timothy, their missions trip is blocked. And if you can imagine, they've probably spent a lot of time to prepare for this trip. They have been in contact with maybe believers in the Asia region, or they have been preparing themselves spiritually for this trip. But it's frustrating for them because now they have to, God has told them to go to this place, but now the Holy Spirit's like, no, you can't do it. This just highlights the sovereignty of God. And what does that mean? The sovereignty of God means that God is in control of every situation, especially when we can't see it. And that comes into conflict with our doubts and our trust in God. Because sometimes we feel like we know what's best. And for Paul and Timothy, they're thinking like, okay, this region really needs the gospel. And that's nothing bad. That's a very, very good thing that they need to do. They are fulfilling the Great Commission. But then Paul has to come to terms with, I need to go where the Spirit leads me. So an example from my life. I was afforded the amazing opportunity to go on a medical missions trip to North Korea in 2014 when I was a junior in college at UVA. This trip was with 26 doctors and nurses and healthcare providers who were going on these biannual, so twice a year trips to North Korea to provide medical aid and assistance. The only problem for me was that this trip fell in the middle of my final exams for my junior year. And so what I did was I worked it out with my professors. I would take my final exams early, submit my papers early, and go to North Korea ahead of time because when I would be in North Korea, I didn't have internet access. I flew out to Beijing, and on that plane ride, I was finishing up this 25-page paper for one of my classes on Bonhoeffer. And when I landed in Beijing to meet up with the team, I was pushing my cart along, and my cart got bumped, and my bag fell, and my laptop broke. And I had just finished my paper on the plane, and I had not submitted it. It would not turn on, despite everything I've tried to do to make it work. So that was very frustrating. And I was like, okay, you know what? I emailed my professor, and I said, I'll find another way to get this to you when I retrieve the files after North Korea. It was about 3 hours before our flight from Beijing to North Korea as a team when Dr. Park, who was the head neurosurgeon, took me aside and said, "You will not be joining us to North Korea." And I was shocked when I heard this because it took 6 months of financial planning for a team, helping arrange the team's agenda, and I brought in 100 pounds of OR supplies from Charlottesville to Beijing, praying for North Korea, raising prayer support. And of all 26 members of surgeons and nurses and radiologists and medical students, I was the only one who fell prey to misfortune. Someone who was in charge in our team of submitting our visa applications forgot to submit mine in February, and it was only a few hours before we were going to Pyongyang that we discovered this incident happened. So I waved goodbye to my team in Beijing as they went past customs. And it was the most frustrating moment of my life. Because someone else goofed, I was not able to go on the trip of my life. Not only on top of that, I was stranded in Beijing without a laptop, and all my files were on there that I had to submit for my papers. And so what I did was I bought a plane ticket to Cambodia, and my original plan was to go to Cambodia with Dr. Park after we spent a week in North Korea, and I would spend 2 months with him in Cambodia helping him with missions work. So that plane ride from Beijing to Cambodia was intensely frustrating, and I struggled to restrain myself from releasing a barrage of expletives to God, because everything went south so fast in just a few hours. And the pounding question in my head was like, why God, why would you make me take my finals early? Why would you stir that urgency for the trip only to have me not go? Why would you deny me sleep and sanity in the past couple of weeks? It was kind of amusing. Why out of all 26 team members, why me? What are you trying to teach me here? What are you trying to do, God? I thought I was following your voice and what you want me to do. Why would you shut the door right at the very entrance to North Korea? So immediately upon finding out this tragic news, I was able to use someone's computer, and I emailed my dad. And he sent me an encouraging email about Ziklag. So in 1 Samuel 29:30, David and his men are on a campaign to conquer the Philistines. But when they return from their excursions with fighting, they find that their camp and all their families are stationed at Ziklag, and they have been raided by the Amalekites, who have taken captive all their wives and children. David's men are exhausted. They're like, we have fought for you, we have won for you, but we come back and we find our children and our wives missing. So they conspire to stone David. But David, when he hears this, it says this in 1 Samuel 36, David found strength in the Lord his God. And if you want to find out the outcome of the story, you can read it in 1 Samuel 30. And so that was the message that my dad gave to me, as well as the one in Acts 16 verses 6 to 10. I don't know why. I didn't know why at the time that the Holy Spirit would bar my entrance to North Korea. And I think that gives rise to this important truth about missions, that oftentimes what we plan will not go the way that we've planned it out. The Holy Spirit and God works beyond our own man-made plans because His will is better. And it's hard for us to see in that moment, but God's asking us in those times when everything goes south, and God's asking us, do you trust me? Do you trust that my plan is far better and superior, not only for you, but for the expansion of my kingdom and the proliferation of my gospel in these countries that you're going to? And so what happens with Paul is Paul goes on to from Troas to Neapolis, and there to Philippi, and he helps with the Philippian church. And had he not been rerouted, the Philippian church would not have been strengthened. He brings this lady named Lydia to Christ, as well as Paul and Silas are thrown into prison. And that's when you hear the famous story of them singing in prison, and the guard and his family come to Christ. I think that's the person, the image, and the vision when someone from Macedonia is calling them to come there. And so the whole point of their rerouting for the Holy Spirit was for a few families and the church of Philippi to be strengthened. So I think later Paul and Silas were like, oh my gosh, that's why you didn't want us to go, God. It's because you wanted us to come into contact with these people whose hearts were ready to hear the gospel. And that's what God will call us to do too. In 2003, when we were in Uzbekistan, we had this missions team from Campus Crusade, or Crew, come out to China, and we were close by, but because of the SARS outbreak, which is a previous coronavirus precedent to our COVID-19, this team was prevented from coming into China. And so they were rerouted from China to Samarkand, Uzbekistan. And they were extremely discouraged because for months they have been preparing to go to China. They were praying for the Chinese people, but instead they came to a Muslim country and they didn't know any of the language that they had been learning so far. So our family took them in. I think there's a team of 14 people. And it was through their ministry that 5 students came to Christ and were baptized. And that's incredible. And not only after that, but after that, that team was so stirred in their heart for Uzbekistan that many of them came back for long-term missions and lived there for years. The Renners were there for 6 more years before they're kicked out, and they are still missionaries in Turkey right now, which is incredible. This is the way that God's Spirit works. God proved that to me, that me not going to North Korea on that trip was far better. I went to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and I had the time to reflect and pray. And I think the biggest thing that God wanted to do was to break down the walls of my heart and to teach me the important truth about trusting in the goodness of God's sovereignty. And it was difficult to let go of my dreams and my plans, and I asked God for an even if kind of faith. God, even if I don't go to North Korea this time, would you allow me to be fully cognizant of your goodness and to accept that your ways are not my ways, but you are in control. There's a phrase that says that our disappointments are God's appointments. And that's true because the team felt really bad for me about not going to North Korea, so they paid for my next trip to North Korea in September. And I went with a smaller team of 5 healthcare providers, including me. Also because that trip, some people were barred from entering North Korea, which was sad. But on that trip in September, my senior year of college at UVA, we made history in establishing the first ever North Korean and International Medical Student Conference in Pyongyang. And for the first time, our team was allowed to go to the villages of Wonsan in North Korea. And so the second trip was a lot better than the first, and that I was able to go on. And so I see God's hand in why he allowed that to happen, because he had to not only prepare my heart for North Korea in the second trip in September, but also he allowed for us to go on more opportunities to see parts of North Korea that others haven't been able to see. Whether you are praying about missions or you're in a time of your life where you don't understand why God is allowing certain things to happen, just look deeper into Acts 16, 6-10 and reflect upon this testimony of my life, of the crew team that went to Samarkand, Uzbekistan, that God's ways are not our ways, and his sovereignty shows us that he is in control. So in the way that it applies to you, whether you're thinking about missions, long-term or short-term missions, or even going about the business of your life in the ministry of the church, you will often come into frustrating roadblocks where you are doing something right or something that is good and mandated by God, but is blocked. And oftentimes the Holy Spirit might block it, maybe because we have not asked and inquired the Holy Spirit if this is his will or not. And that shows that we neglect prayer often. We just jump into the pool without testing the waters first and testing the Spirit to see if it's okay. So can you trust in God's sovereignty? And you can learn from the life of David, the life of Paul and Timothy and Silas, the life of the crew short team members that came to Uzbekistan,